spiritual warmth and wisdom at your fingertips. You are watching Fireside Chat.
Hi, thanks for joining us today, and thanks to Evolve Beyond Borders for having the three of us on this session. I wanted to introduce myself. My name is Jason Morris. I've been in the background screening industry for the good part of over 25 years. I was the former co-founder of Employee Screen IQ, which was sold to Sterling in 2015. I am a past chairman of PBSA and past board member, and I spend my time now consulting and recruiting in the background screening industry, maintaining thought leadership as well. And I do a lot of venture capital work in various industries, including investing in some businesses in the background screening supply chain. So today, I'm honored to be on this panel or moderate this panel with Andy Hellman. Andy is a published author and frequent presenter on all things related to global background screening, ranging from GDPR compliance to artificial intelligence. He has over 25 years of experience in organizations ranging from venture capital-backed startups to Fortune 100s, including 20 years in background screening. He also holds his CIPP and CIPM certifications, as well as fellow in information privacy. Thanks for joining us, Andrew.
Thanks, Jason.
And next, we have my background screening brother, Bon Idziak. Bon is a 25-year industry professional and expert in background screening, drug testing, and HR technology. Prior to joining NetForce Global, Bon was the Chief Compliance Officer and Government Relations Officer at Accurate Background, Head of Compliance and Government Relations for the screening startup Checker, and the CEO of Applicant Insight. Bon also held several roles at First Advantage in the early onset of his screening career, which is when I got to know him. Bon is well-versed in policy, procedure, and compliance. He's frequently asked to share his expertise in conferences, in educational settings, and with industry stakeholders. Bon regularly consults with major national employers and associations to develop screening solutions that are cost-effective, compliant, and address corporate goals and regulatory requirements. Bon is also a past chairman of PBSA, past president and chair of the International Legal Committee for SAPA, and board of directors and past president of HR Open Standards Consortium. And he was the president of HR Open Foundation and the president of the Sue Weaver Cause. So, Bon, thank you, my brother, for being here today.
Thanks, Jason. My pleasure. I'm looking forward to it.
So this should be fun. We've got some questions about international background screening and how that's conducted. And we're going to talk a little bit about privacy and regulations and what's changed over the last couple of years. So let's start, if you guys are ready.
Let's do it.
Let's do it.
All right. So I'm going to start with Bon, and I'd like to hear both of your answers to all the questions that we're answering, and I'll kind of flip-flop on who I ask first. But Bon, how have the regulations and requirements for cross-border background checks changed in recent years, and how have these changes impacted the way companies approach international hiring? It's a mouthful. It's going to be a long answer, I'm assuming.
Oh, it's a great question, Jason. And as you were introducing Andy and I was adding up the amount of time each of us has spent in the background screening industry, and I'm grateful that there isn't a fourth on the panel, because that would literally be a century of time spent in screening. And, I would argue that we have evolved personally the same way that background screening internationally has evolved over the years. Evolution is the right term to use. I think, today, everyone in the process is much more educated about screening and how it works. And that means that the candidate or the subject of the screening understands what their role is and also what their rights are, probably what their rights are most importantly. But so does the employer, so does the background screening company, and everyone else that's involved in the supply chain. And I think with the evolution of knowledge also comes a stronger demand for documentation and procedures around screening. And so, we look at how screening is performed in any given country, and what is allowed from a screening perspective, right? Where you can get information lawfully and how you can use information lawfully, and how does that tie into the various stages of relationships that we have across the supply chain, to use a term that you used in your own introduction. The formalization of requirements from the candidate through fulfillment is really what we've seen grow, along with regulations as they emerge, whether they be privacy concerns, whether they be more restrictive in some parts of the world or less restrictive in others. It is a constant evolution, and being able to meet the growing demands, not just from the candidate employer perspective, but also from the regulator perspective, is a challenge that every participant in the process will continue to face. So, a strong focus on compliance and a strong focus on new things like publishing of rules and policies and procedures as they relate to those rules is something that everyone has to become much more familiar with, if you're not already, and really embrace as part of the process. So, long answer to long question.
So, I have a sub question on that. I haven't really been involved in the processes with background screening, especially international background screening, in quite some time. But so it seems like it's gotten, on the supply chain side, like you said, easier to get the information, or in some ways to get the information like different than it was 20 years ago. But the regulations have made it more difficult. Is that a true statement?
Yeah, I don't know if I'd use the word difficult. What I would use is complex, right? I always say that the background screening industry is not terribly complicated, but it is rather complex. And while it may be easier to get to information because, quite frankly, communication is easier, right? With the advent of Zoom meetings and Microsoft Teams and other means of communication where we can connect with one another, regardless of where we are on the globe, and the planet has just become much, much smaller over time. The complexity in the how and the what is where we've seen a real change in the industry over time. And I'll just give you an example, right? In some countries, access to criminal history information is completely lawful, and criminal history information is open to the public. But that doesn't mean that the IP address that you're trying to access from will be allowed within the country. So it could be that you could do it yourself and you could get direct access to those court records, but only if you're located within the boundaries of that country. And so that's one of the things I think that is much more complex, where technology has evolved and the procedures around accessing information have evolved to the extent that it really requires a deeper level of knowledge.
Yeah, it's funny because people used to say, like, I don't want to be a CRA because the FCRA is so difficult. It's really not. It's not difficult at all. It's just, like you said, it's a little complicated, or a little complex. But once you know how to do it, it's just second nature. It's not that difficult of a process.
Yeah, don't give our whole business away.
Andy, what do you think?
I think Bon touched on a lot of the key points, and I think that really at a high level, there's a lot higher expectations. Not to be repetitive on the wording there, but all the things that Bon's talking about as a result, the customer knowing that these requirements are out there, that these laws are being enforced. Just like in the U.S., to your point, Jason, people in the U.S., I've been on the international side for a while now, and I always say the U.S. is the most complicated place to do background screening, just because you've got to adhere, and if you don't, you're going to get sued. Outside the U.S., people haven't paid as much attention to it for a while, but with all the regulations and the awareness of these regulations out there, the client has become more sophisticated and a lot more demanding. And so they're paying attention to things like data residency, data transfer. How are you getting this done? How are you accessing this data? Wait a second, are you using this form going through that process and things like that? So, to Bon's point, it's not necessarily complicated per se, but you need to keep track of everything and be able to answer those questions now. Used to be a black box. Clients would say, go get me a background check from wherever. You do it, you come back with whatever answers there were or there weren't, and that was the end of the story. Now they want to know, really how the sausage is made, and make sure, it's my single origin sausage from this location and exactly what went into it, and the traceability all the way through the supply chain. So At the same time, it offers an opportunity for those of us that really focus on doing it the right way, I think.
Have we seen regulators at all go after background screening companies in the U.S., foreign regulators, or like an uptick in lawsuits, international lawsuits, or anything as a result of background screening, or is it too immature for that to even have started yet?
Bon, you want to answer this one? Or you want me to? I can think of one. I'm sure we're both.
Sorry to throw a curveball at you. I was just thinking about that as you're answering these questions.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to say yes on a couple of different fronts. First, the end user, right? The end user is of interest in many countries where background screening is more restrictive. And, you would probably think that Europe in general is more accessible and that the laws would be less restrictive than they are in other parts of the world. But the reality is that the laws in Europe are even more restrictive. In some countries prohibit, for example, the use of criminal history screening with very few exceptions. And it's the fitting into those very few exceptions that companies, employers are really struggling with. And so we saw a case in Spain that was rather complex where the end user was investigated by the regulator, and it got rather messy for them. Fortunately, the background screening company had all the right language in their agreements. Takeaway number one, had all the right language in the agreements to protect them from any actions by regulators or litigation in the country related to that kind of screening. And then in other parts of the world, we have seen regulators take a stronger look at the screener and impose sanctions for access to certain types of data or use of certain types of data, where you may consider it publicly available, you may consider it open information, but it can be unlawful to use information in certain ways. And so you have to be really smart about it. You have to really know what are the restrictive laws that are stated on websites, and what fine print is written into the contracts where you're accessing database information, and determine whether or not it's lawful to use it, and certainly make sure that you've got yourself protected when you're reselling that information, or most importantly, when you've got an employer that wants you to provide them the information, even if you don't think it's lawful to do so. So there's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah, there is. I might come back to that because or maybe we talk offline. I'm really interested in the international landscape when it comes to lawsuits and everything. All right, let's go to the next question. So what are some of the best practices for conducting cross-border background checks in a way that is compliant with local laws and regulations? Let's start with you, Andy.
Yes, I would go back to the comment. It's not a black box anymore. It can't be a black box anymore. That as a company hiring people with these global backgrounds, lived, work, studied all over the place, you can't just trust that everything's getting done correctly. And to the court case that Bon mentioned, ultimately, that's where the responsibility lay on the hiring company. You need to really focus on knowing where the data is flowing. Do a data mapping exercise to find out, my data goes here, from there it goes there. Where's the data being stored? Companies, we all use technology platforms, applicant tracking systems, screening platforms, databases. Those things get hosted, thanks to the cloud. Without asking, most of us have no idea where our data is being stored. But where that data is actually residing is extremely important a lot of times to which regulations, which laws apply. And so as a company doing the screening, it's not enough to say, just go get me the information. You really need to be a diligent, informed consumer to make sure you know what they're doing, how they're doing, so you can make sure that you're compliant. Because at the end of the day, your name's going to be associated to it, regardless of actual liability.
Cool. Bon?
I think we've seen a pattern emerge that is important for folks in background screening to understand. And it may be more prominent with larger screening companies at this stage, but definitely is going to impact small to mid-sized companies across the globe. And I think when we get outside of the US and screening, a lot of the local screening companies or local providers for fulfillment purposes are smaller businesses than some of the background screening companies that we have here in the US. Where I'm going with this is the local buyer, right, has become much more attuned to privacy laws and responsibilities that they might have for privacy as well. And it's no longer a case where a company in the US who is hiring an employee who was once in China or Germany or the UK. So what we're really experiencing with screening that's happening now on a global scale, as companies in the US expand their operations outside the US, and as local screening becomes more prominent in areas where it has not been previously, is an educated buyer. And so in the US, we're often dealing with what I would call human resource counsel or regulatory counsel that's familiar with the Fair Credit Reporting Act or other laws that regulate screening here. But outside the US, it's usually privacy counsel that we're dealing with. And they're less focused on the process and more focused on what information we're collecting and how we're using that information, the flow of information, and the structure that's in place to manage that from inside the US, outside the US, and even when there's global screening that's being conducted between multiple countries outside the US, how that's being performed and by whom. So there's a lot more transparency in the process. There's a lot more visibility into who's responsible for fulfillment. And with that also comes a degree of trust, right? So when you're in the wholesale space, for example, like many of us are, we have to provide full visibility into who's acting as fulfillment in country, and what the exchange of data looks like, where it's living when the data is at rest, and how we keep it secure. So it's definitely become much more interesting over the years, and will continue to do so.
Andy, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that.
Sorry, Andy did start this one.
Oh, right.
Just
sorry.
Remind me.
I'm just trying to roll.
All right, well, let's go with the next one. And we'll go with Andy on this one. How can companies balance the need for thorough background checks with the importance of protecting candidates' privacy and personal data?
Yeah, I think it's a question of looking at what you do and why you do it. You know, there's the danger of having been in the industry for a long time, like we have, is you get complacent. This is what you've done, and you're just used to it, and you look at other things, but you don't look inwardly to reassess what you're doing and why you're doing it. You know, I'll give an attribution, a shout out to a colleague, Kirsten Baggis, who Bon knows very well. She works at his company, but you know, she's been a proponent for many years of, for example, questioning the requirements, the ordering requirements to do a search. And this is one of those things that it's kind of just unexciting, uninteresting. You know, no companies are throwing lots of money at solving the problem of ordering requirements or anything like that. But at the same time, this is where some of that intrusiveness, the overcollection happens. We go to a candidate and we say, look, just give me everything, because I don't want to have to hassle with coming back and asking you for more 3 days from now. So I'll just get it all now, just in case I need it. And the reality is that probably 80, 90% of the time you don't need it. And really the right thing to do might be don't collect it in the first place, but 10% of the time go back and ask for it if it turns out you do. And so she's really pushed on going and saying to everybody in the supply chain, do I really need to give you this? Is this really required? And it's even little things like that that I think that we have to look at as people in the supply chain, in the industry, to really be good stewards of people's personal information. You know, the kind of the comment that not a question of if you're going to get hacked, it's just a question of when. Well, if the data's not there, there's no risk to it, right? And so the more we can do in data minimization, protecting candidates, things like that, I think is really important, because some of it's required. There's no way to get around it. We have to collect some personal information to do what we do. The less we collect, the better. And along with that, there's a certain, even just what we search, what we process. I'm doing a criminal record check on somebody. I'm collecting employment, education, whatever it might be. I think the same holds true there. Are there better ways to do it? You know, under GDPR, you're required to make that assessment. It's good practice anywhere in the world. Why am I collecting this information? What am I going to do with it? Is it truly necessary for the purposes I'm trying to accomplish? You know, it's interesting that people kind of think of the U.S. as being not the most privacy or a candidate or data subject friendly country, but in a lot of ways, some of this has already happened here, right? You think about use of credit reports, for example.
Yeah,
It used to be totally commonplace. We did, and everybody started to realize, hey, wait a second, I can make the argument, but does that connection really hold true that a credit report is relevant to whether this person is going to do a good job or not? So the reality is we've already kind of gone through some of these iterations here in the U.S., and we're starting to see it outside the U.S. as well.
It's funny that you mentioned Kirsten. I couldn't agree more with her advice, and I honestly don't know a more thorough person than Kirsten Bagas. So I think those are wise words that should be absorbed by everybody listening today. Bon, you have anything to add there?
Collection limitation, I think, is the term that Kirsten really stresses. And, Andy, I think you use the formal term data minimization. There's a delicate balance, right, between not collecting too much information and having enough information to be able to perform the screenings effectively. And employers in general were less sensitive to collection limitation, I think, prior to the advent of privacy laws in the US and GDPR, with expanding privacy laws in Brazil and China, India, and other countries. The realization that you may not need as much information as you think you need, and you might not need to keep it for as long as you think you need to keep it, I think has been a real point of reflection for background screening in general. And we are getting better at it.
Data retention, I think that there's a lot of companies still today that just operate in the US that don't understand it and right. Don't follow any policies and procedures. So sorry to interrupt, but that was, that's been on my mind a lot lately.
I don't want to point any fingers, but we could probably all point them at ourselves. At one point, we thought that there was real value in keeping everything forever. And that made us more valuable for some reason because we had that data to reflect on when we were looking at metrics or other areas of our business that we're trying to manage to be more efficient and more effective. And I think what we've learned through data minimization and these new privacy laws is that we can still do all those things without maintaining a social identification number or a date of birth or a person's criminal history information, or, I think even more importantly, a copy of a person's passport or driver's license. Because when we have those things in our possession, you open the door, Andy, to, data breach, right? It's not just a matter of will it happen? It's a matter of when. The less information you have and the more security you have wrapped around the data that you have, the safer that you're going to be and the more likely you're going to emerge from that. There are companies in the space that I've known very personally that have been hit with ransomware attacks or have other vulnerabilities where now they're on the hook for protecting an individual after the fact when there are things that could have been done beforehand to lighten the load and lessen the risk. So these are going to be, I think, lessons hard learned for a lot of companies in the space and a lot of companies around the globe. But they're lessons that we're all going to need to learn, and hopefully we can do it together to stay on the front end of it.
Yeah, and you said it well. We used to all see so much value in all this data and keeping it for so long, and then you start looking at the value versus the liability. And I'll be honest, the value for a long time, especially in my early on, was more so than the liability. But that paradigm has completely shifted now. I know background screening companies that don't keep things longer than 2 years. And really, I don't see why they should. So I couldn't agree more there. Okay, Bon, let's start with you on this one. How do cultural differences and language barriers impact the cross-border background check process, and what strategies can companies use to overcome these challenges? And let's also fold into that how AI is going to be helping with that in the future.
Well, the AI piece is interesting. We could probably spend a session just talking about AI and background screening, right? And how it's led to the evolution of fulfillment. That's a big question. So I'm going to leave that one for the end. Culture is important as it relates to screening. And I think it often dictates what information we have available to us, whether it's criminal history, or identity type searches otherwise. And language barriers can be a concern because oftentimes we're working with in-country resources, regardless of where we're screening, in order to provide fulfillment services. And there is oftentimes a disconnect, right, between the employer who's in another part of the world and the entity that's engaging with a local employer or a local college or university, or the local police or court systems. I think that language barriers are not as much of an issue when it comes to fulfillment, because we do leverage across the industry local resources in many cases, especially when there could potentially be a language issue. But I think it's the cultural differences that really come into play. There are still many parts of the globe where we're performing screening where the governments are corrupt, and they're known to be corrupt. And we have to navigate those and perform our due diligence and expect that we're getting the best information that is available from the source, even if there's known corruption, that we're still meeting any local requirements for due diligence that may be tied to certain positions, like in the financial industry or in healthcare, where an employer may have specific responsibilities, but also understand what those limits are and perhaps be flexible with your expectations and set them reasonably, so that when there is a loss of translation, or perhaps when a person does have a criminal history or did not receive a degree, but it was otherwise confirmed, that we understand what that really means and how it could have been missed when working with police agencies or working with courts, or how it could have been perhaps confirmed when we're talking about employment and education, where the person didn't work there or didn't go to school there. The reality is that this happens a very small percentage of the time, but it does happen, and it's really more related to the culture that we're screening under and less related to the procedures that are in place between the screening companies and the entities in country that are responsible for fulfillment. So that's a lot. That's a lot. AI, you asked the question about AI. I think, it has really given us a lot of tools that we can utilize for the verification and confirmation of identity, and even the validation of things like diplomas and employment records, where we can identify through the use of technologies and the fact that they're getting smarter and smarter every day, to look at what applications were used to create or modify those documents, and how have they been built into these tools, so that we can say, this was modified using an Adobe product, or this document was created in an HTML5 environment, right? Where we know it's not authentic as having been issued by a government agency or by a school. It recognizes the seals or the lack of seals and the differences in fonts and all of those things that the human eye has a hard time deciphering, but the machines are getting smarter and they're doing a better job.
I think even from a servicing standpoint and an operational standpoint, when I'm thinking about AI, I'm thinking that I don't need, 5 different people speaking 5 different languages in my call center anymore, because I've got tools that can translate in real time and have a conversation with somebody in real time while it's translating for me. So I think AI brings just a ton of opportunity, especially for doing business internationally.
Oh, can I share just a brief story along those same lines?
Yeah.
We love to debate. I think that's one of the reasons you call me your brother. I'm still trying to figure out which one of us is big brother and which is little brother. But there was a real life scenario where we were doing a translation project of a legal document for a customer in, I don't know, let's just call it Japan, right? And so we performed this translation, and these documents all get posted, and then they're part of the hiring process. And an executive at the company is going through the process, a new executive, and reads through the document and says, wait a minute, this doesn't make any sense, right? It actually doesn't mean what it's intended to mean. In fact, it completely misses the mark. And so, we look at the tools that were used for translation, and this ties directly to the question that you asked, because it was the cultural interpretation of the words that got lost in the translation. And so we ended up getting legal resources involved in country, We communicated with them the intent of the document, not just the words that were used within the document. And we ended up with a completely different document and a completely different process. In the process of that, right, everyone had a little bit of egg on their face for how it went. But boy, did we learn something very important, that you can't always just translate the words and have them make sense. Sometimes you have to take into consideration what they mean in the culture and whether or not that is relevant to the process, right?
Yeah, and I always answer that question. Like with AI, I always say, look, it needs to fulfill a function, and it needs to fulfill a function and do it better than a human. And that part of it's not hard. And that's not hard, you know? It can be right 98% of the time, where humans are right 60% of the time, whatever the thing is, but you're going to find mistakes. I think until it really matures, it's going to be really important for humans to still oversee, a lot of these things on the translation stuff, but it's definitely the future. The technology is unbelievable.
Agreed.
So, Andy, what do you think?
I'll go the opposite direction. I'll just make a brief comment on the AI piece, some thoughts on that, and go back to the, kind of the cultural bit. But the AI, it's interesting because, talking on the personal side of that. So my wife is great at languages. It drives me crazy. She picks up a language, she listens to it, and all of a sudden she's speaking fluent. Her accent's great. And, everybody knows I'm the American from a mile away. But I'll ask her, hey, can you look at this and translate this for me? And she'll have no idea what it is, because when you learn a language, usually felony, misdemeanor, all these terms that are unique to our industry, right? That's not part of the typical jargon. And so I think that's back to Bon's point too. The story he shared is that AI has got to have a data set to learn on, right? To do these conversations. And so much of what we do in our world, it's everything, but in the real world, we're a niche. And so sometimes there's not enough learning content for the AI to really get good at some of the very specific conversations. So, if you wanted to have AI reviewing criminal record results and making assessments about things, it's really difficult to do that. In the US, we have so much data. We work in auto adjudication projects outside the US. Those things become more challenging because of limited data sets. And I think that's going to be one of the hurdles that AI will have to overcome to really add value in our industry. But kind of segueing back to the cultural issue, I'm going to look at it from the opposite side of things. That I used to give the analogy, having been international for a while and talked to companies hiring all over the world, even China, India, over 1 billion people. It's still really tough to find a qualified candidate to take on a role and do a good job. And I used to use the analogy, it's like cable TV here in the US. I get 1,000 channels on my cable TV, but I only ever watch 5 or 10 of them, right? There's all this content, but only so much of it is worthwhile. Maybe a better analogy now that, Netflix has got, 30,000 titles on it, but my wife and I still spend 45 minutes every night trying to find something we want to watch. And so that candidate experience becomes incredibly important in this hiring process. And the increased globalness of the hiring process now creates an additional challenge for everybody in the chain to work with these candidates, because they go through the process, they get courted, everything's great, they're fantastic, the company hiring them is fantastic, and then all of a sudden they go to a background check. And outside the US, they're not always that commonplace. So all of a sudden you switch gears from everything being all roses and googly eyes to this incredibly invasive, collect your personal information. I don't remember this. How do I find when I graduated? What was the address for here? Process. It's not a lot of fun. And so when that process, then those issues get compounded because a company may not be culturally sensitive and they're putting everything, to Bon's point, in US terminology that may not translate that well, either very literally or even figuratively, to these candidates. It can be difficult and it can turn them off. And some of these candidates may have job offers from 2 or 3 companies, and one company's got a really good process that's more culturally sensitive, that works well, that's easy, that's smooth, that's streamlined. And then company B is putting them through this paper form that's 20 pages, that collects way more information that's needed, and so on. Where's the candidate can ultimately go? And so I think that's where the cultural challenges can also come in. It's just being aware of that, trying to adjust it. It's not always an easy, just do this and solve the problem. But I think we need to focus, just, the whole topic of this evolve beyond borders. Our organizations need to look at becoming more diverse and multicultural and multi-country to be able to have people on our teams that can help us be more aware and more responsive to these needs in the marketplace.
Interesting. Yeah. I have a couple more questions here, but I think we're running out of time. And I want to, the next two questions, I think I can make more of a statement than asking a question. You're really teaching me a lot about international screening. It's changed quite a bit. And it really seems, like Bon said earlier, it's complex. It's not difficult, but it's complex. You really do need an expert. You really need a professional that specializes in this type of international work. CRA should listen up. They should be going and talking to the people that know their stuff rather than trying to do it themselves to save a little bit of money. The price you pay for international and cross-border screening is significant because, like you said, it's complex. There's a lot of laws. There's a lot of regulations. You take what you have to do here and now multiply it by 250 different countries. And then the different variables of that, which country is going to which country and where it originates. And it really has become fairly complicated. But when you go to professionals for complicated things, and that's why you guys are really good at what you do. So let me close with this. Any closing thoughts or anything else you would want listeners to know about international or cross-border background screening that they might not be thinking about, and what the future could look like?
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts, and really these have come to me during this conversation with the two of you. I think insights are important. And even though we're all friends, right? I've known you all for a really long time. And I would say, in addition to the fact that we're friends, we're trusted colleagues, and we would rely on one another for this type of information if we found ourselves in a position where we needed help in any area, whether it's with AI or rules around data collection or privacy or data protection laws. We rely on a little help from our friends. And that's very true of the background screening industry. It's a really small world. And even though when you look at the total opportunity economically across our industry, it's a really small industry with a very maybe niche group of players that are focusing on things outside of their own geography. So there's not a tremendous pool to leverage, but there are ways to leverage the pool of resources that are available that can be quite effective. And so I think one of my closing comments, in addition to the fact that everyone should constantly review their policies and procedures and make sure that they're evolving when they're expanding into new countries or when there are new laws or regulations that are being passed. Also, stay connected to other people in your field, whether it's through LinkedIn or through our industry associations or collaborative opportunities at conferences or with online events such as this one. That's how we really continue to learn from one another and understand what's really needed in order to not just compete, but thrive in the space. So I know that
none of us and none of the companies that have been successful in the last 20 years in background screening would have been that way without us getting and collaborating together. And we did so much of that. And being competitors was not even a thought about it. And I see that with some of the younger screening companies. They're afraid to talk to their competitors. And I would tell you that none of us are still here. Right. None of us would be here today if we hadn't done that. So I just wanted to throw that point out there. Andy, any closing thoughts?
Taking Bon's comments a little bit further too, there's nobody in the industry that does it all internally. Hard to make blanket statements and be correct, but I'll make that blanket statement. There's no company, large or small, that does everything in-house. We all rely on a network. We all have to work together to a certain extent. And so the key is finding the right people to work with and collaborating with them. I say this in a lot of times in presentations and talking, that you've got to approach the people in the supply chain as your partner. You can't just throw it over the wall. You can't just issue demands, because at some point you're going to rely on them for an answer. For example, hey, I need to know this, or can you help me out here? And so I think both of you guys, are saying this, that it's your network in the industry. Don't look to think that I'm just getting all the knowledge in house and I'm going to be able to answer all the questions or something like that. It's never going to happen. It's just, the 250 countries you mentioned, Jason, there's no way everybody's going to know it all. So it's really about having a good network around you, whether it's directly your suppliers and your vendors or people you know in the industry, because that's going to allow you to be successful and stay on top of what's happening.
Yeah, and I just want to echo one more thing that Bon had said earlier about policies and procedures. I act as an expert witness. I've probably done 30 plus cases in my career, and I can't tell you how important having solid policies and procedures are. If you take one thing away from this entire conference, it's making sure that those are dialed in for your company. Every lawsuit that I've been involved with as an expert always boils down to the policies and procedures. Was it systemic, or was it a person making a mistake? And that can be the difference between a $40,000 check to go away and a $4 million judgment against you. So well, that's all the time we have today, and I appreciate you guys taking the time to talk to me and educate me for sure. I've missed a lot in the last couple of years, and it's nice to have experts like you guys on the call and part of this conference. So thank you, and thank you to Evolve Beyond Borders, and looking forward to seeing everybody soon.
We've really enjoyed it. Thanks, Jason.
Yeah.
Thanks, Andy.
Thanks.